In the summer of 2011, a chilling discovery shattered the calm of St. John, New Brunswick, Canada. Richard Dick Oland, a 69-year-old Canadian millionaire, known for his ruthless business acumen and vast wealth, was found brutally murdered on the floor of his office. His body bore the horrifying evidence of no fewer than 40 blows to the head, delivered by a blunt, possibly hammer-like weapon. The scene itself suggested a crime of passion, hinting that the killer was someone Dick knew intimately, perhaps even loved. This is Tony Crush, and today we're delving into a case that, at first glance, seemed straightforward, yet quickly unraveled into a labyrinth of oddities, procedural missteps, and conflicting narratives. It's a story punctuated by extensive critiques of the investigation, a multitude of theories, some more outlandish than others, and at its heart, a wealthy family whose deep-seated secrets simply refuse to stay hidden. Let's explore the complex layers of the Richard Oland murder. The Olands are one of New Brunswick's oldest and most prominent families. By 2011, Richard, or Dick as he was widely known, commanded an estate valued at approximately 35 million Canadian dollars. He and his brother, Derek, had once jointly run the Moosehead breweries. However, a very public battle for control in the early 1980s saw their father select Derek, not Richard, to inherit the family business. Undeterred, Dick forged his own path to success, founding trucking companies and an investment firm. He also championed numerous charities and was instrumental in bringing the Canada Games to St. John in 1985, an achievement that earned him the Officer of the Order of Canada, the second highest honor for merit in the Canadian system of orders. Dick and his wife, Connie, had been married for 46 years, residing in a meticulously restored ancestral mansion called Far End in Rothesay, a residential community just outside of St. John. Their only son, Dennis, lived next door with his wife, Lisa, in the large two-door style house where Dick himself had grown up. The couple also had two daughters, Lisa and Jacqueline, both married and settled locally. Richard Oland's investment firm, the Far End Corporation FEC, was named after his historic home. The business operated from the second floor of a three-story red brick building situated in the financial sector of uptown St. John. On the morning of July 7th, Dick's longtime personal assistant, Maureen Adamson, arrived at the building, as usual, just before 9:00 a.m. As she ascended the stairs to the second floor, she immediately noticed that the door to the office suite had been left unlocked. Inside, the lights were still on, and the air conditioning unit was running at full blast, yet no one appeared to be present. When Maureen had left the night before, sometime around 6:00 p.m., Dick had been at his desk, deep in conversation with his son, Dennis. The next morning, a creeping concern forced Maureen to peer into Dick's workspace. There, on the floor behind the large desk, Richard Dick Oland lay face down in a pool of blood. The scene left no doubt the 69-year-old millionaire was dead. The brutality of the attack was immediately apparent. Richard Oland had been struck on the head no fewer than 40 times by a blunt, possibly hammer-like weapon. What struck investigators as peculiar was the absence of the murder weapon. No objects in the office were deemed potential candidates, nor were any items missing that could fit the description. Whatever was used had been brought into the office and then meticulously carried back out again. Spatters of blood were found up to 75 meters away, and a full 360 degrees around where Dick had fallen. It was a gruesome, horrific crime scene. Yet, curiously, there was no blood trail leading from the office into the lobby, or towards either the front door or the rear exit. It was as if the murderer had committed the heinous act and then simply vanished from the scene. Investigators from the St. John Police Force SJPF quickly concluded that the killing was unlikely to have been a robbery. An iPad, digital cameras, Dick's wallet, his Rolex watch, keys to his BMW, and an envelope full of cash were all left untouched. What was conspicuously missing was Dick's iPhone. Multiple calls and texts to the phone had gone unanswered. The last text message received was at 6:44 p.m. the previous evening from Diana Setlisic, a local realtor who had been Dick's mistress for the past 8 years. After a series of unanswered messages, Diana's final text simply read, "You there?" The only other item believed to be missing from the office was a letter from Diana to Dick, its exact contents unknown. The last person definitively known to have seen him alive was his only son, 43-year-old Dennis Oland. Preliminary autopsy results, combined with the scene evidence, clearly indicated that Richard Oland was a victim of foul play, a homicide. A handful of potential witnesses provided statements to the SJPF. On the ground floor of the FEC building was Printing Plus, a business owned by the landlord and a friend of Dick's, John Ainsworth. At 6:00 p.m. on July 6th, John was in the Printing Plus office with his friend and former employee, Anthony Shaw. Initially, both John and Anthony told investigators that between 7:30 p.m. and 7:45 p.m. that night, they both distinctly heard a loud crash on the floor above, followed by a series of rapid thumps. It seemed, chillingly, that the men had actually heard the murder take place. Though they did not realize it at the time, neither reacted to nor investigated the noises, they simply continued working. Across the street, at around 7:30 p.m., a family attorney working late in her office told police she overheard an argument between two men emanating from the FEC building. She later requested to remain anonymous. Finally, the office on Canterbury Street was directly across from a trendy and popular restaurant called Fandy. A patron of this restaurant, a man named Jerry Lowe, reported seeing an unidentified man in a black t-shirt exiting the front of the FEC building at close to 8:00 p.m. If these witnesses were to be believed and their times accurate, Dick Oland was almost certainly bludgeoned to death between 7:30 p.m. and 8:00 p.m. the night before his body was discovered. Around 6:00 p.m. on the day Dick was found, his son, Dennis, sat down with St. John constables for questioning. No one in the Oland family had been told how Dick had passed away, but they intuitively knew it couldn't have been from natural causes. Dennis told the constable there were far too many police cars at the scene for this to have been a heart attack, for example. But in exchange for this speculation, he was offered no details about what had happened to his father. Dennis, in his mid-40s, was in his second marriage, with a blended family of 4 children. He worked as an investment advisor and resided on a large Oland family property in Rothesay, about a 15-minute drive from the heart of St. John. At this early stage, the investigative team was already aware of a few key facts that cast Dennis Oland in a suspicious light. He was the last person known to have been in the FEC office. They had also learned that Dick was a difficult and demanding father. And lastly, Dennis harbored significant, ongoing financial troubles. His father had recently provided an interest-free loan of roughly $500,000 to bankroll his expensive divorce. This had allowed Dennis to remain in his cherished family home with his new wife, Lisa. "I was very likely going to lose my home," Dennis recounted. "And this is a home it's an old family home. It was owned by my grandparents, been in the family for 70 years. And there's a farm behind it." He expressed profound gratitude that his father stepped up and said, "Look, that's not going to happen." Dennis believed his sisters were unaware that his father basically bankrolled my whole divorce case, which ended up being $85,000. It was a very lengthy divorce. And then, because I had to basically give half of my assets to my ex-wife, he bankrolled that as well so that I could keep my house. So basically, I have a mortgage with him, which is an interest-only mortgage. So, at the end of the day, we were talking about, a loan of $500,000 or $600,000 is a lot of money. And I was grateful for it? Right, man. Of course, yeah. As anybody would be. As anybody would be. It's a lot of money. Hey. The SJPF found that Dennis had developed a habit of living significantly above his means. Between January and July 2011, he spent $86,000 more than his income. He had exceeded the $163,000 limit on his line of credit and was $5,000 over his $27,000 credit card limit. Dennis had also missed 2 repayments of just over $1,500 owed to Dick, in addition to 1 mortgage payment of just under $500. With an annual income as a stockbroker of $34,000 and his father as his largest client, Dennis was precariously reliant upon the millionaire to stay financially afloat. The St. John police suspected that Dennis had gone to his father's office the night before to ask for money, and, crucially, they believed he had been refused. During the first half of Dennis's initial interview, he appeared relaxed, calm, and surprisingly talkative, even laughing at times. He spoke openly about his relationship with his father, acknowledging that their dynamic was admittedly awkward. Richard Oland, despite his immense success, wealth, and Canadian fame, was a difficult man. Socially, he could be abrupt and off-putting, and in business, he was notoriously ruthless. In his home life, Dick was described as a domineering father and an adulterous husband. Yet, despite all this, the man was generally well respected, and his family made allowances for his eccentricities. It was simply how he had always been. Dennis discussed his father in both positive and negative lights. Was he the easiest guy in the world to get along with? No, Dennis admitted. But not to the point where, someone would, who knew him would want to do something to him. It's not like that. I mean, knowing him as long as we all have, a person's character, you want to keep your distance, that kind of thing. And look, with him, it was a lot easier to keep your distance because it just kept the peace. And he had this saying that you can't be friends with your son. Right. And I get that. He wasn't friends with his father. I don't think I wanted to be friends with him, but... Dennis initially told the constable that he couldn't think of anyone who would want to harm his father. But then, his speculation began. Perhaps the assailant was someone on drugs who wanted money. Could it have been an ex-girlfriend? Maybe even his mistress, Diana. Because of a grudge or revenge. When asked who would benefit most from his father's death, Dennis returned to the idea of a desperate drug user. Someone who wanted $20 out of the wall to buy drugs. This is reaching a vindictive ex-girlfriend, he mused. But, I don't know that woman, so I don't know. But no, I think he's pissed a lot of people off, but not to that point where someone would, want to kill somebody. The only person that comes to mind is this supposed girlfriend because she really seems to be a whack job. Like, they call her the Dragon Lady. She's this hostile, somebody who you'd think could be that fatal attraction type person. But that's just, I don't know the woman. So that just means saying stuff that I hear. I think it's true, but... The conversation then took a critical turn when Dennis was asked to recount his exact movements from the day before. After leaving his own office around 5:00 p.m. and driving to Canterbury Street to see his father, Dennis's story became notably convoluted. His stated intention was to bring a collection of genealogical documents to discuss with his father, family history being one of the few areas where father and son shared a common interest. Dennis arrived at the building with a red plastic bag full of documents. But once he reached the stairs to the second floor, he claimed he suddenly remembered an ancestral journal he had left back at his own office. Despite his office being within easy walking distance of Canterbury Street, Dennis inexplicably got back into his car to retrieve the journal. Then, he claimed, he thought better of it and returned to the FEC building with the original collection of documents in the red bag. This was at approximately 5:30 p.m., Personal assistant Maureen recalled that Dick gave his son a friendly reception and overheard them discussing ancestral records as she packed up for the day and left around 6:00 p.m. Dennis was then captured by a security camera down the street, on his way out of the office at 6:12 p.m. After this, Dennis's memory began to fail, and he omitted crucial parts of his story to the police. Well, I think it's interesting because I was there twice. I first parked in the parking lot where he parks. Okay, so when I walked out and I walked that way and then, oh, my car's over here, and I walked over there and hit my car, and where was it? Here's right across the street, from the office, in front of the restaurant, yeah. Yeah, like whether it's in front of or... At this stage, the constables found his behavior increasingly suspicious. His movements suggested he was distracted, flustered, and not thinking clearly the way one might behave if they were either extremely agitated or planning a violent act. Dennis initially omitted telling the constable that he had turned the wrong way onto a one-way street after leaving the office at 6:12 p.m. Not only that, but he recounted how he texted his wife at that point to let her know he was on his way, but accidentally sent that text to his sister instead, to the SJPF. This was simply more flustered behavior, more unexplained actions. Now, why wouldn't you have mentioned that to me the first time? I mean, that's a significant thing. Dennis replied, "Well, you asked me. I actually really think about this. And I'm really trying to think about it. And so it wasn't significant. I guess, to me. I didn't realize that you went the wrong way the first time. No, not the wrong way. No, I didn't realize that my route planning was so significant." The most significant omission made by Dennis Oland during his questioning, however, was about how many times he had actually entered the FEC building. Much later, the police would learn that Dennis's exit at 6:12 p.m. was not his last. After that, he had returned to the building once more. He claimed he did so to retrieve a logbook that Maureen had asked him to deliver to his mother. There was no one left to corroborate his reason for returning to the office for a third and final time. The SJPF began to formulate a theory. If Dennis Oland had gone to the FEC office to ask for money and was refused, he could have reacted in a rage. The theory suggested his first visit to the office was characterized by hesitation, with surveillance video showing his car driving past the office building on 3 separate occasions before he finally parked his silver Volkswagen. The St. John police couldn't account for these seemingly aimless loops. Determining there had been plenty of nearby parking options, on the second visit, when he finally met with Dick, he must have confronted him. An argument would have ensued when the millionaire refused to give his son more money. Dennis, enraged by the refusal, left the office. In a fit of anger, he walked the wrong way to his car. When he found the vehicle, he texted his sister instead of his wife, and then proceeded to drive the wrong way down a one-way street. Then, he parked again. And then, Dennis returned to the office and murdered his father. An interrogator, pressing Dennis, articulated this motive. "What you've told me, Dennis, is about money. And if I grew up in your circumstances with money all around you, at this stage of my life, I would expect to be sharing in some of that. Not battling with that son of a bitch every single day and having him control every aspect of my life because he wouldn't give up any of his goddamn money. You didn't plan this, Dennis. He brought this on. Pushed you, squeezed you, rubbed your face in the fact that he controls it all." However, this theory had glaring inconsistencies with existing evidence, namely, the crucial time of death. The loud banging noises from the second floor were overheard at Printing Plus between 7:30 p.m. and 7:45 p.m. Yet, Dennis's phone records showed a call with his wife between 7:24 p.m. and 7:28 p.m., during which time they were both at home in Rothesay. Lisa, his wife, testified she had been resting in the sunroom when he arrived, and they spoke on the phone to locate each other in the house. They then ran some errands. By 7:38 p.m., Dennis was shopping at the drugstore with Lisa. Only minutes later, the store security camera captured him purchasing a few food items for dinner. The cameras even caught him having a casual chat with his aunt, Dick's only sister, whom he ran into at the store. All of this took place while Anthony and John, miles away, listened to noises consistent with the murder occurring on the floor above. Initially, investigators found no inconsistency with this timeline. In fact, they determined that it was more likely that Dick had been killed an hour earlier than previously thought. Analysis of Dick's computer revealed no activity after 5:39 p.m., roughly the time Dennis arrived. The lack of interaction on his computer or responses to Diana's many messages suggested that Dick was incapacitated, likely already killed. Between 5:45 p.m. and 6:40 p.m., the window when Dennis had exclusive opportunity to attack him. The last text message received on Dick's missing iPhone was from Diana at 6:44 p.m. The call she placed only 2 minutes later went directly to voicemail. The killer, they theorized, could have destroyed or turned off the phone at that time. Although Dick's cell phone was never located, the last text message pinged off of the Fairvale Tower in Rothesay. That tower was near the wharf where Dennis had made a brief stop before returning home. This seemed to place the missing cell phone with Dennis shortly after the murder. It was fair to say that the case against Dennis was largely circumstantial, but he remained the prime suspect. The Oland family, however, stood firmly by Dennis, believing the truth might lie in exploring other aspects of Dick's life, such as his notoriously ruthless business dealings. One proposed theory, which would account for the baffling lack of a blood trail out of the office, posited that a professional killer, or rather, 2 hired professionals, did the job. In this version, put forth by a Canadian crime writer, Dick's death was both revenge for a business deal gone wrong and a chilling warning to others. The killers would have brought a hammer into the building as their weapon of choice. After the brutal attack, the killer would have stepped onto a garbage bag or plastic sheet, meticulously laid out on the floor, then undressed on it, shedding the bloody items. Then, wearing new shoes and clothing, they would have carried the evidence out, leaving from the rear exit. There was perhaps a third man acting as a lookout in front of the building, who was spotted by Jerry Lowe while dining at the Fandy restaurant. Proponents of this hired hitman theory often pointed to a failed multi-million-dollar venture called the Can Sugar Refinery. Dick had taken a central role in the initiative, connecting investors, promoting it, and coordinating other aspects. The Can Sugar Refinery had what was described as a catastrophic launch. It quickly became clear that the imported raw sugar cane was too coarse to refine for human consumption. The company folded in less than a year, and its largest investors, a Russian and Ukrainian man with rumored ties to organized crime, rapidly lost over $17 million. Other investors, including a local businessman in the province of New Brunswick, also lost their stakes entirely. Dick Oland, however, was said to have emerged from the initiative financially whole. In the months after his death, Rogers Communications, a Canadian-based cellular provider, informed investigators that they had detected a roaming error on Dick's phone on July 9th. This error indicated that the phone was still functioning but was out of range of Rogers' signals. The logical conclusion was that the phone had, in fact, been carried out of the country in the days after the murder. If the idea of organized crime seemed too far-fetched, the Oland family also pursued other leads through a private investigator. The PI delved into Dick's personal affairs. It appears that his mistress, Diana, was never seriously considered a suspect. Her husband, Yuri, 30 years her senior, was interviewed by investigators. The 87-year-old had only become aware of his wife's affair after Dick's murder and was ultimately ruled out. However, the Oland's PI did uncover another of Dick's girlfriends, a wealth advisor with whom he spent time on and off at the Chapman Hills Suites and on sailing excursions on his yacht. When questioned, she denied the affair outright. The SJPF, notably, did no further digging on this lead. Although, according to the Olands, there were indications that Diana was overtly jealous of her. And that's not all the rumors swirling around Dick's life. Rumors also circulated in St. John that Dick had carried out an affair with his son's ex-wife, Leslie. Could Dennis have killed his father in revenge for this affair? According to Dennis, this was nothing more than a hurtful rumor, one that nonetheless gained traction across the city. He claimed the rumor had been created by none other than the jealous dragon lady, Diana Sedlicek. On July 14th, Dennis and Lisa Oland's home was extensively searched by the SJPF. Given the bloody nature of the crime scene, they anticipated locating a number of stained items, or perhaps even the weapon and the missing cell phone. They seized over 50 items, including shoes, pants, shirts, blue shorts, a garbage pail from the bathroom, and Dennis's cell phone. Search teams even dug up parts of the family's yard in an effort to find buried evidence. At the Renforth Wharf, where Dennis had stopped on his way home, teams meticulously searched and canvassed the area. 2 witnesses saw Dennis at the wharf that evening, but neither saw him throw anything into the water or dispose of any items. His wife's boat, the Loki, was also searched. Dennis's car, a silver Volkswagen, underwent a rigorous 16-hour examination over 3 days using alternative light sources, chemical agents, and DNA swabs. The forensic teams found nothing incriminating in the vehicle. Although Dennis texted his sister just after he was suspected of bludgeoning his father, there was no blood detected on his BlackBerry's keyboard. Only one piece of truly incriminating evidence was located: a brown sports jacket with visible bloodstains. Security footage from a Tim Hortons coffee shop on July 6th captured Dennis wearing the same jacket. Maureen, Dick's assistant, had even noted him still wearing it when he arrived at the office, remembering it because it was an odd choice in the sweltering heat. Dennis had provided incorrect information to police when asked what he was wearing on the day his father was killed. He very clearly stated he wore a navy blazer, not the brown sports jacket. When the brown jacket was tested, it returned positive matches in 3 locations for blood. The stains were extremely small, but the DNA was a definitive match to Dick Oland. Based on this, members from the St. John police force arrested Dennis Oland, the son of Richard Oland, and charged him with second-degree murder. When Dennis Oland went to trial in September 2015, controversy was already brewing over the handling of the case by the St. John police. Their treatment of the crime scene brought into question the very integrity of the physical evidence. In the hours after the horrific discovery, the scene had become a kind of spectacle. Multiple unauthorized persons entered the office. As many as 16 officers entered the crime scene on day 1 without any shoe covers or gloves. The area was also improperly cordoned off. Crucially, areas of interest, including the foyer, the washroom, the stairs, and the exits, were not isolated and processed. Police even used the office bathroom for 2 days before they bothered to test it for blood and DNA. They were also using the rear door to the building but never tested it for fingerprints, even though it could have been the killer's escape route. A footwear impression on the bloodied floor was discovered on day 2, but due to the failure in protocols, it was initially assumed that the impression was left later by an officer and not part of the crime scene. However, when noticed in early photographs of the scene, investigators recognized their potential significance. The pattern was compared to the shoes Dennis wore that day and every other pair he owned. None were a match. Dennis Oland's defense also poked significant holes in the Crown's theory of motive, which was 3-pronged. Dennis had a bad relationship with his father. He disapproved of the affair with Diana, and he was angry over being denied more funds from his wealthy father. The Crown told the jury about the unlikable Richard Oland, describing a man with a multi-million-dollar sailboat on order in Spain who kept his wife of over 45 years on a strict $2,000 per month budget and required her to keep expense receipts. They outlined the dire financial hole Dennis had dug himself into, arguing he was at risk of losing the family home. However, the defense argued there was no evidence that Dennis would make any immediate financial gains from his father's death. Dick's will was clear everything went to Connie first. Only after her death would Dennis or his sisters receive anything. Dennis had missed only one mortgage payment on the ancestral home, which was not actually at risk. Additionally, Maureen testified that Dick had left coordinating payments for Dennis's $500,000 loan to her. He and Dennis never spoke about it directly. Maureen told the jury that Dick inquired about it only once in a blue moon and was not at all concerned about any missed payments. The loan was, in essence, money that would eventually be Dennis's inheritance anyway. If he never paid it back, the balance would simply be deducted from his share later. There was never any indication that Dick, as strict as he was with his money, had ever denied financial help to his children. But the Crown had two solid pillars to its case: the jacket and the time of death. The brown jacket Dennis had lied about wearing was indeed stained with his father's blood, and Dennis's wife, Lisa, had taken it to be dry cleaned the day after he had lied about wearing it to the police. The defense argued that the stains were inconsistent with spatter from an attack. They were very small, and more blood would have been retained on the jacket, even after dry cleaning, if it had been worn in the room where the murder took place. The defense argued that Dennis had simply misremembered which jacket he had worn that day. He had even left the dry cleaner's tag on the collar of the jacket when he hung it back in the closet, seemingly ready for the police to find. The dry cleaners testified that they always checked for tough stains to spot treat before washing any item and would have remembered if it was covered in blood. Nonetheless, the jacket seemed to directly connect Dennis to the scene. Then there was the time of death. The potential discrepancy with witness statements was seemingly overcome when Anthony Shaw and John Ainsworth from Printing Plus stated they could no longer be certain of the exact time of the noises on the second floor. Anthony had originally stated, "I knew it was a while after I got there and quite a while before I left, so I would guesstimate to be around 7:30 p.m. But when he testified at trial, Anthony contradicted that earlier statement and told the jury it could have been much earlier. He stated the noises occurred sometime between 6 p.m. and 8 p.m. John, distracted by computer issues that night, was no longer confident the noises happened around 7:30 p.m. either. The Crown believed that Dick's inactivity on all electronic devices ending much earlier in the evening, at just before 6:00 p.m., and never resuming, even after Dennis had left the office, was a clear indication that he had been killed while Dennis was exclusively in the room with him. To the shock of the Oland family and many who had been following the trial, Dennis Oland was convicted of murdering his father. The trial was the longest in the province's history, spanning 37 days over 3 months and calling over 40 witnesses. 1 month after the verdict, his defense team filed an appeal. They claimed, among other things, that the trial judge had given incorrect instructions to the jury regarding Dennis's misstatements to the police about his brown jacket. The judge, they argued, failed to instruct the jurors that they could interpret the statement as a mistake. Without this instruction, the jury was left with only the Crown's interpretation that Dennis had simply lied. The appeal court stated, "The jurors might well have found the appellant lied about the jacket he was wearing, and in the closing moments of their deliberations, distilled from that bare finding the clinching element for their verdict. We are therefore compelled to quash the conviction and order a new trial." The Crown did not offer any new evidence when the case was retried a year later. The defense team, however, countered the incriminating evidence more thoroughly. A technical error made by law enforcement in using inappropriate databases to check potential jurors merely caused a mistrial. But the case proceeded as a bench trial in front of Justice Terrence Morrison, who would render the final verdict. Justice Morrison ultimately found reasonable doubt in more than one area. He found Anthony Shaw's testimony disingenuous, believing that Anthony's animus towards Dennis impacted his testimony. The earlier statement Anthony had given to police that the banging on the second floor occurred at 7:30 p.m. or 7:45 p.m. was deemed more truthful, especially since he gave this statement before he was aware Dennis was the prime suspect. The justice explicitly wrote that if Dick was murdered any time after 7:00 p.m., Dennis could not be the killer. In response to the DNA on the brown jacket, the defense explained that in the months before the murder, Dennis and Lisa had stayed for a time in Dick and Connie's home while their own renovations were underway. During that time, while Dick and Connie traveled, they stayed in the master suite. Dennis had hung his clothing alongside his father's in the bedroom closet. The justice determined from expert testimony that the stains were likely from a transfer, not spatter from an attack. The justice also grappled with evidence suggesting Dick had alcohol in his system at the time of his death. He had been in the office the entire day, ate lunch at his desk, and there was no alcohol in the building. At some point during the day or after Dennis left, had Dick popped out for a drink? Testing suggested he had not had a drink for several hours before he died, but never established a firm time frame, a detail the justice called a mystery. But perhaps most significantly, there remained unanswered questions around the striking lack of physical evidence. Where was the murder weapon? What had become of Dick's cell phone? How was there no blood found on any of Dennis's other items of clothing, in his car, or on his phone? There were too many missing puzzle pieces, and the investigation had simply not accounted for them. On July 19, 2019, 8 years after Dick's murder, Justice Morrison found Dennis Oland not guilty. Dennis had spent a total of 10 months in prison while awaiting the appeal of his conviction years earlier. But after this decision, he was truly a free man. In 2023, yet another book was published detailing the murder and proposing new theories, including speculation that Dick Oland had become too involved with organized crime, or perhaps had fallen victim to a cuckolded husband of one of his many girlfriends. No further arrests have been made in the case, and that, in its enduring tragedy and perplexing mystery, was the case of the Canadian millionaire, Richard Oland. This is Tony Crush, and I'll see you in the next one.